We don't have a whole lot of domestic manufacturing currently online. And with the IRA, we see more incentives for getting that domestic manufacturing online. So in the next 10 years, maybe we'll have a greater ability to source these panels at scale. But currently, if you wanted to meet 100% renewable only electricity, there just aren't enough panels for the entire United States. So if each state says, oh, by 2035, I want to be 100% renewable energy only, it's just not currently feasible.
Hey, welcome back, Solar Warriors, to another SunCast episode. I am so grateful that you are investing with us, the only non-renewable resource you've got. That, of course, is your time. Promise we'll give you a great return for that investment. The only thing I ask you to pay is attention, and pay attention you will if you are at all interested in how states like Maryland could serve as a bellwether for other Midwestern and perhaps even Northeast states looking at aggressive renewable energy targets. Also, if you're looking at how to get a job in the renewable energy sector, in particular solar, well, today's guest at one point never imagined that she'd be in the solar industry. And I'm thankful that she reached out to say that SunCast was a helpful resource for her. Today's clean energy advocate, Stephanie Johnson, has an extensive policy and advocacy background, currently serving as the president and founder of the Maryland Renewable Energy Alliance. She's working to advance that state's progress towards clean energy goals and builds on the foundation as executive director of another regional solar trade association, a SEIA affiliate, where she led legislative and regulatory campaigns related to state-level solar energy across the Mid-Atlantic. I promise that even if you aren't actively involved in policy, this is an episode that you want to tune into. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have Stephanie on the show. And if you haven't subscribed to SunCast, well, hopefully we'll earn your subscription. If you do subscribe, you won't miss out on our twice-weekly content just like this. Founders on the front lines of the clean energy transition, nearly 700 episodes deep. You can find them all at mysuncast.com or right in the podcast app that you're listening to probably right now. But for now, let's get ready to tune up your skills, Solar Warrior, as we tune into another powerful conversation here on SunCast. Well, Stephanie, it's good to finally have you on the show. I imagine, given our previous conversation, you've heard "Let's get ready to tune up your skills, Solar Warrior" a handful of times.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me, Nico.
Yeah, I alluded to it in the intro, but it is always interesting and flattering when someone reaches out and shares that SunCast in some way or other has made a meaningful contribution to their career. I'd love to hear about your journey to finding the solar industry, and in particular, and selfishly, especially for those who maybe are finding SunCast for the first time. How did SunCast in any way play a role in helping you get acclimated to the industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I worked with Catherine McLean at Dillon Green. She's a recruiter. She's wonderful. She had reached out to me about a role, and in preparing for those interviews, having no background in the solar industry, I started reading articles. But when you have no background in solar, it's very acronym heavy. No, you can't piece together what folks are talking about. It's very difficult. So I went to the podcast. I just started downloading as many as I could. I'd listen for maybe like 2 or 3 minutes. Some of them were too technical, too slow. I just delete it. I couldn't get into it. And then when I ran into SunCast, I was like, oh, this is great. It's quick. It's easily packaged. I can understand what they're talking about. I listened to a podcast on NEM, and you dug into what it was and what the implications for changing it were. And I was like, okay, this is great. So I think I listened to about 10 of your podcasts prior to my interviews. And then when I showed up, they were like, oh, it says here you've never worked in solar, but you seem to know a lot about the industry. And it really helped me connect with the folks I was talking to. And I really appreciated SunCast's ability to put really complex information into a form that folks can connect with and understand and relate to.
Thank you for that. I'm incredibly grateful that, over the last 8 years, we've been able to get feedback like you're sharing. And honestly, while I've had guests say, hey, Nico, I'm a listener, I'm a big fan, you may be the first guest I've had to put into words exactly how it helped contribute to your becoming a contributor to the industry. And and you do so in a way that benefits lots of folks. Some folks can take an individual contributor role, but as the executive director of a SIA affiliate, the work that you were charged with affects hundreds, thousands of individuals. I can't express the sense of fulfillment that gives us on the SunCast side to know that we're having that sort of a role in helping educate folks like yourself. One thing that probably stood out to you from the very beginning, and as we're here in Women's History Month, it's something that we definitely focus on, is that the industry is in still fits and starts of trying to figure out, what does diversity really look like for this sector? As an outsider, what was your assessment looking at the solar industry and considering how to contribute as a female leader?
Yeah, I think coming from my background in corporate compliance, working with Fortune 500 companies who've spent a number of years really putting weight and money behind increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was a bit of a shock coming to the solar industry. It's very white, it's very male, it's very technical. The background of many solar companies is construction, so it reflects that in a lot of ways. The folks who were most interested in the industry 20 years ago tended to be white and male. So I think a lot of those companies have made a concerted effort to increase the number of women on their teams, to increase the number of people of color who are given opportunities. I still see a disconnect between the women and the people of color being given opportunities on executive teams. So I see that as a bit of a schism in the solar industry. And I think that as the industry matures, you'll see that gap get closed. But I think we need more concerted efforts and more buy-in from decision makers. And you see Abby Hopper at SIA puts a lot of time and effort into raising up diverse voices. I think she's doing an excellent job. Her posts on LinkedIn are very impactful. She's willing to go out on a limb and say things that don't necessarily make folks comfortable. And I think that can be very impactful.
The Solar Sisters movement that has arisen within the SIA organization is great to see as well. I remarked, I think, at the RE Plus Northeast event, I failed to remember the young lady's name. She works at Bodie. She made a post about the Solar Sisters gathering. And while I thought that it was really heartfelt and touching, the reality was there were 5 women at dinner. And that same evening, I had participated in a dinner of 10, mostly men, right? And we didn't call it the Solar Brothers dinner. I really hope for our industry that the representation of female leadership, which categorically across all metrics increases both the level of emotional IQ in an organization, as well as the actual bottom line profitability of a company with female leadership. I hope that our industry will foster a Solar Sisters collective that is 50, 100 strong even at regional meetings. I know that it is that deep of a bench, so to speak, at the RE Plus annual, but there shouldn't be a room big enough to hold the Solar Sisters at the RE Plus annual meeting. You mentioned someone that had a entirely instrumental role in your career change, as it were, Catherine McLean. I have featured Catherine on our SunCast Career Summit, and she's been a longtime collaborator with us. For those who are unfamiliar, Dillon Green is a bespoke recruitment firm focused exclusively on diverse candidates for the clean energy sector. Catherine particularly focuses on folks of diversity, females, people of color, and has been retained by companies as big as Lightsource BP, right? Like Catherine's done a phenomenal job. What advice would you give to folks who are in some way resistant to the idea of working with a recruiter? I find ironically that that's a common sentiment that people will ask me, hey, do you know of any job opportunities? And my question is, what recruiters have you talked to? They know where all the jobs are. And they're like, oh, I didn't talk to any recruiters. It's kind of like they consider this the equivalent of like going and talking to a mortgage broker, but you need a mortgage for your house, right? Can you talk about your experience there and maybe through your career, the process of engaging with a recruiter?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would mention that not all recruiters are alike and approach it in the same
Mm.
way. When you work with the larger recruiting firms, they have numbers to hit. They're trying to meet metrics. When you work with someone like Catherine, as you said, it's a bespoke firm. She really gets to know her candidates. She gets to know the folks who are hiring. She's able to holistically figure out what a candidate brings to the table, what a role needs. Even if you don't have a background in clean energy, she can figure out what you've done in your past that can be applied to a new role and your ability to grow in that role. And I think she's very good at connecting with her candidates, at being honest about the process, at being honest about what a company is looking for, and if you're a good fit for one role or if you're not and you should look at different roles. I found working with Catherine to be extremely impactful. Usually when you're going into a job interview, you don't get a background of the person interviewing you. Catherine always gives a rundown of this is the person, this is their background, this is what they prefer to see in a candidate. They really like a follow-up email. Don't say this, don't do that. She can give you really insightful feedback after the interview as well.
Over the years, that's definitely the thing that. So I've only ever gotten placed with one recruiter, and it's been 8 years since I've taken a job. And the 2 prior jobs were through my network. But when I did work with a recruiter, and as I was considering new job opportunities, one of the things I was grateful for, and I know that Catherine and William and his team at Energia Works and John Simmingson at Peak Demand and Chris Terzo, like these guys and gals, they're all givers. Like they're so open about how to help candidates position themselves well. And they have the thing that we're all missing, which is pattern matching. They've seen more interviews happen than we have. They've seen more failures because of this, that, or the other thing. The area that you just mentioned, I leveraged the most when I was trying to get my job at Trina, and even when I was negotiating my contract at Conergy, without any compensation, but because they wanted to see my career succeed and they know that as a result, I have referred people over to them. Recruiters in my network helped me negotiate my contracts. They helped me think through the terms. They helped me decide, like, is this actually a good deal or a good pathway for my career? I think that folks overlook that external filter that a recruiter can provide in your career. All the people that I just mentioned, by the way, if you're looking in the industry, you should absolutely be building a bench of recruiters that you are in connection with. And if you are building a company in this industry, whether you decide you want to work with a recruiter or not, you should have these relationships and keep them warm. You know, there are these folks will work hard for you, and they really are advocates for seeing your company grow and can help you find people that you'd never find on your own. I think of this one guy, Silas Monners, young guy recruiter out of New York, who is he just works harder than anybody else I know, including all of the recruiters I've mentioned. And he is just in his 20s trying to build a practice and trying to make meaning out of his career. Well, you did find a role that helped you pivot into the clean energy sector and make meaning in sort of this nexus of your advocacy work and your desire to do something that leaves more of a legacy on the industry. As a result, you became one of the few, I'd say, policy nerds and experts around a very specific market, that being Maryland. At the outset, I alluded to the fact that Maryland, in some ways, is a bellwether or even a warning sign for states that are trying to hit aggressive renewable energy targets. So for those who are unfamiliar, would you unpack a bit how the Maryland market is structured and perhaps how it's different from neighboring states and peers? What's unique, what's not unique? And then let's unpack a bit, what's working and what's not.
One thing we have in our favor in Maryland is we have a legislature that's dedicated to clean energy and figuring out a way to make it work. We have aggressive goals. They're finding ways to fund a lot of these programs. But at the same time, we're a land constrained state. We have Western Maryland that it's very forested. There's not a lot of great transmission lines. So if we're thinking of opening up Western Maryland, we're going to have to see more transmission out there. And then when you're talking about building clean energy closer to where folks live, it can be very contentious on the Eastern Shore with the farmland, figuring out there are a number of farmers who are interested in both farming and having smaller projects on their land, but their neighbors don't want to see it. So in Maryland, we face a lot of headwinds when it comes to actually siting the infrastructure upgrades, the substations. We're going to need battery storage. We're going to need ground mounted solar. And we face a lot of pushback when the rubber meets the road. So there are a lot of folks in Maryland who want to see clean energy get built, but when it comes to the point you actually have to start sacrificing something, that's our pain point right now.
So for those who are unfamiliar, in 2022, Maryland legislature passed the Climate Solutions Now Act. What is that act aimed to do for the state of Maryland?
Yeah, so the Climate Solutions Now Act has a number of working parts. For the solar industry, it's mostly related to our ability to meet 50% clean energy by 2035. We are about 50% below our current carve-out goal, so we have a lot of work to do when it comes to siting these projects. And for Climate Solutions Now, I think we're about $1 billion a year below our funding necessary to make this a reality. So we're also looking at where can we find this funding. There's currently legislation, the Renew Act, aimed at getting fossil fuel companies to pay for the necessary upgrades that we need: home electrification, energy efficiency, substations, transformers. We need a lot of upgrades to make this transition a reality. So we are struggling with figuring out how to fund it.
It's interesting. I think a lot of states are setting these aggressive targets. I think 20 or more states now have a net zero target. A number which is escaping me now. I have 100% renewables target. Maryland presently has a 50% renewables target. But the Climate Act that we mentioned, the Climate Solutions Now Act, has a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 60%, a net zero goal. That's by 2031, only 7 years away. Net zero goal by 2045. Building energy performance standards that are set to reduce at least 75% of electricity from low or zero carbon sources. Let's see, what else? Electric vehicles. Is it 2031 that the state must electrify an entire fleet of cars and light duty trucks by like 5 years later? And then incentives for community solar for low and moderate income customers through tax incentives. But the reality is how will states like Maryland fund these initiatives? And one of the ways that the state incentivizes, which is pretty common throughout the Northeast, is SRECs. Could you give us a little bit of a primer on the market for SRECs and why in Maryland, as in DC and New Jersey, it serves as a core component to incentivizing renewables as a part of the renewable portfolio standard? And then we'll talk about the flip side, the carrot and the stick.
Yeah, so right now there's a lot of contention about SRECs in Maryland. One issue we find is it's a one-size-fits-all program. So utility scale projects, 300 megawatt projects, get the same incentive that a rooftop commercial project gets. And with economies of scale, some of these projects don't need the same level of incentive to get built. So there's contention between these different groups. The rooftop solar groups want a higher SREC for them, either a lower SREC for the utility scale projects or no SREC for them, which obviously these projects get financed and they're kind of locked in and they depend on that incentive to move forward and get built. So once you've got this incentive on the books, these companies who come in depend on that moving forward to get their projects built. There are a number of potential solutions that folks have looked at, but holistically reinventing how SRECs work in Maryland is very complicated. And I don't see a lot of consensus around what we should do beyond, 1 year, 2 years. What are we looking at in the next 5 to 10 years? I can't tell you. I don't think we have consensus amongst the industry at this point.
So I want to take it to like 30,000 feet for a second. For those who are unfamiliar, could you define an SREC and how it's calculated in Maryland, and maybe even what the market price is for an SREC right now in Maryland, and contrast that with other states?
An SREC is a solar renewable energy credit. So companies depend on this revenue based off the ACP, which is the alternative compliance payment that a utility would need to pay if they're not meeting the solar carve out, if that makes sense. So we're so far below the solar carve out that I think we're beyond 50% below where we're supposed to be hitting.
In
There's
terms of
not
the
a
solar that should have been built. Yeah.
solar that should have been built. So there's been a push to potentially multiply SRECs for certain projects, but then it gets a little hairy because you don't know when you're going to hit the ceiling, and if you hit the ceiling, then the price will crash.
Right.
So you have to figure out which projects absolutely need a multiplier, if a multiplier makes sense, if we should just reinvent how we're tooling this.
And an SREC is calculated basically per 1,000 megawatt per megawatt hour, 1,000 kilowatt hours. So 1 megawatt hour is one renewable energy credit. And in the state of Maryland, 1 megawatt hour is given a price of about $60. To contrast that, what are they in DC?
They're hovering around $450, $500.
Mm-hmm. And in New Jersey, we just looked up averages around 200. Over the last 3 years, pretty consistently 200. Pennsylvania over time has vacillated between 50 and 500. So they can wildly fluctuate based on the number of generators in the marketplace. Why do you suppose Maryland is so dramatically low compared with its peers? I mean, New Jersey, next door practically, is more than twice the value.
Yeah, that's a good question. When it comes to comparing Maryland and DC, you're looking at a very different ratepayer impact, and you're looking at a different makeup of ratepayers. So in DC, I think they have more programs for low-income solar, low-income community solar, so those folks are less heavily impacted. But when you look at Maryland, it can be a very negative impact on the low and moderate income folks who are paying electrical bills. If you have a high SREC, that gets folded in to the utilities overall charge of what they have to charge for electricity. So it's pretty complicated, but last year we had a bill in Maryland to freeze the ACP, and the overall ratepayer impact would have been $800 million, which is not insignificant. When you're looking at meeting these aggressive targets, you have to figure out the timeline in which it's feasible. So we only have a certain number of panels that we can deploy currently. We don't have a whole lot of domestic manufacturing currently online. And with the IRA, we see more incentives for getting that domestic manufacturing online. So in the next 10 years, maybe we'll have a greater ability to source these panels at scale. But currently, if you wanted to meet 100% renewable only electricity, there just aren't enough panels for the entire United States. So if each state says, oh, by 2035, I want to be 100% renewable energy only, it's just not currently feasible. So that's one issue to look at. The second issue is, like I mentioned previously, siting and permitting in local communities. We're seeing a lot of pushback. And then the infrastructure upgrades, I think the timeline for getting a new transformer is about 18 months. So when you start upgrading homes to heat pumps, to having folks charging their EVs at home, that electrical load can trigger the need for more infrastructure upgrades in a neighborhood. And we have to figure out which neighborhoods we're targeting, which neighborhoods get the upgrades first. And there's a holistic need for planning that it's going to require a lot more collaboration with utility companies, which in the past, there hasn't been particularly great collaborative efforts between the solar industry and utilities, which in the early days, utilities might have been more antagonistic towards solar, but you see more and more of them adopting that technology in their own operations, which is progress.
Well, I mentioned a minute ago, and this comes back to sort of helping folks understand how SRECs work and how these markets function, that there's a carrot and a stick. And some of the reading I was doing, there are a lot of articles. If you want to try to figure out how SRECs work, I'll point folks to some by Energy Sage and Solar Reviews. I think Energy Sage tends to do a really good job. They've got a great chart that I'll mention. But ACP, many folks think of as the American Clean Power Organization, the sister or sort of sister org to SEIA, if you will. But it actually, in government or policy terms, refers to the alternative compliance payments. How do ACPs come into play with regards to SRECs and the SREC market?
So an ACP sets a floor for what a utility will have to pay if they're not meeting their compliance obligations under the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the RPS.
So my reading of it is it's more of like a ceiling on what RECs prices would be, right? Because they would just pay the ACP if RECs were higher.
So in Maryland, I think the ACP is $30 and the RECs are $60. So they're not in line. So they're not 1-to-1.
So it doesn't set a cap on it, so to speak.
Right. But it can't go below that, I believe, unless the market crashes completely because you've met your compliance obligations. So what you'll see in Virginia is Dominion met all of their compliance obligations. So it's unclear how they're pricing RECs because they met the compliance obligations. They bought enough renewable energy. And that can make the market difficult to predict.
Yeah. And lest folks think that Maryland is sort of unique in pricing. I was looking up, Pennsylvania is now set around 48. Virginia, the state that Dominion mostly operates in with solar, is 50. DC, as you mentioned, is often over 400. Maryland, 60. Ohio, 5 for RECs. Really almost no market there for RECs. I would call that no market. We're bringing this up and talking about it specifically because how policy incentivizes the local economy is how most industries thrive or constrain. Policy for the North American Free Trade Agreement was the first domino in a long chain of events that led to outsourcing most of our manufacturing first to Mexico, then to China. So policy really does have a core influence on how an industry can survive, thrive, grow. Through your work with these advocacy organizations, you, by and large, are working with policymakers and advocacy groups as an intermediary. Talk to me a bit then about the value of these alliances to not just state participants, meaning solar companies in the state of Maryland and elsewhere, being able to benefit from these policies, but also the work that you do helping prevent sort of downside risk and foster growth.
So in Maryland, you see a lot of work coming out from the League of Conservation Voters. They're very engaged. They work very closely with policymakers. They do a lot of that bridge, those bridging gaps. So for League of Conservation Voters, they have very good relationships on the local level with folks like the Maryland Association of Counties, where solar groups don't necessarily have that collaborative relationship. And when you work with folks like LCV, you can get folks to the table to talk and at least hear you out. So I think, as we're trying to build more projects on the local level, having those conversations will be key because they typically haven't taken place early enough in the process. So they start taking place like when you're trying to build the project and it's the first time someone's hearing about it and they're like, oh, I've never heard of you. I've never heard of this technology. Like, get out of my community. When you work with folks like LCV who are on the ground a lot, and they do a lot of outreach and they're very pro renewable energy. They want to see this transition happen and they want to see it in a way where local communities feel like they're a part of the process. So my recommendation to companies is to get involved early and to work collaboratively with groups who have those really good relationships in the communities you're trying to build your projects in.
So I'm glad that you went there. I think that one of the things that we're seeing over certainly the last 12 to 18 months is an increasing need for developers, installers to focus on community engagement, community involvement. I think this is potentially more important, and I welcome your feedback, but potentially more important for the utility, the community solar, and the large C&I folks. But how important is it for residential installers? Is there work that can be done for residential installers in the area of contributing to leaning in some way to policy or these advocacy groups?
Yeah, I think for the residential market, it's important for companies to show that they're good actors, that they give back to their communities. So what you see with community solar developers or utility scale developers is they try to go into a community, find local groups that they can donate to for the project to say, this project has donated X amount of dollars to this local community group. We're bringing in tax dollars, tax revenue, we're bringing in local jobs. For residential installers, they tend to employ more local people, which is great, and they highlight that. But are you working with local schools? Are you doing community solar installs? Because there are a lot of nonprofits, and I've seen that with a number of residential and commercial installers across the country who will donate a certain number of panels, a certain number of man hours to actually building rooftop solar for free on local community organizations, and I think that can go a long way in showing that you're engaged in your community and you genuinely care, and it's not just about the next sale.
Where have you seen in the few years that you've been working at an advocacy level? Where have you seen communication breakdown? Where do we have a need for more work? Maybe speak at the Maryland level, and folks can infer for their own jurisdictions how it might also play out.
Yeah, so one quote that comes to mind that lives with me daily working in this industry is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, it's tempting to treat everything as a nail. So when you're working with a rooftop solar company, a lot of them, their messaging is around like rooftop solar can solve the entire energy transition, buy my rooftop solar. And when you look at utility scale projects, they're like, home electrification is really irrelevant. What I need is transmission lines. And those are their messages. And when folks hear that, it can be bewildering to the average person who doesn't understand energy, and they can latch onto one or the other. They can say, oh, well, I heard that we can do this energy transition with just rooftop solar. And it's like, well, realistically, we're going to need rooftop solar. We're going to need batteries. We're going to need transmission. How are we going to charge these EVs? Like, I live in Baltimore City. I can't charge at home because I don't have a parking pad and I have a one-way street in front of my house. So we're going to have to figure out how to make this transition work in a really holistic way. And I don't think those conversations are happening at scale yet, because each person has a thing they sell and that's what they talk about. But as we're moving forward, it's going to become more and more important that we're making sure that we are selling the thing that we sell in a way that benefits the entire energy industry. Otherwise, you're going to max out at maybe 20% penetration of rooftop solar, and it's going to hit a wall, and you're going to get one transmission line, and you're going to hit a wall, and the policymakers aren't understanding like what's broken, like what's not working. Like, I gave you what you wanted, but I'm not getting the solution you promised me.
So, as the founder and president of the Maryland Renewable Energy Alliance, where do you see you can add the most value in the next 6 to 12 months? What are you spending time on day to day?
As the clean energy transition is progressing, there's a greater need for collaboration across these technologies. And the solutions that we're going to need are increasingly going to require more than just solar and storage. We're looking at solving for full home electrification. We're looking at solving for replacing retiring power plants. And that puts a lot of strain on the grid. Like, how can we meet that electrical demand if we're retiring these power plants? So what are the feasible solutions? So what I'm trying to do is get stakeholders at the table to realistically assess the problems we're looking at, and then realistically assess how we can deploy the solution quickly enough to meet the increased electrical demand that we're going to see with home electrification.
What do you feel are the most readily available tools for policymakers right now to catch up, as it were, in Maryland? Because as we stated, Maryland is $1 billion behind, and trying, while at the same time, environmental organizations are trying to double the commitment from 50 to 100% renewable.
Right, that's correct. So I think this session in Maryland, we've seen folks coming to the table. PJM came and gave a presentation. I think that was very helpful because they provided that holistic conversation of everything we're looking at on the grid. And they also discussed, what is the increased electrical load going to look like as EVs come onto the grid, as we start installing heat pumps, and how do we account for that? There have been a number of studies at the PSC level, one by the Brattle Group, that was helpful in showing that the grid can handle quite a lot of electrification. But if we're retiring these power plants, how are we going to meet that electrical need? And I think, there are a number of legislators who are pushing for reform in siting and permitting to streamline this process so we can get smaller scale community solar programs permitted and on the grid faster. And I think in the next couple of years that we'll start seeing movement there, and more willingness to give up a little bit of farmland, maybe a little bit of forested land. And if the alternative is keeping a coal plant on, you have to make that decision. Do you want to have a coal plant, or do you want to, temporarily give some farmland for community solar development, which could be decommissioned and reintroduced as farmland later down the line?
Are there states that you are watching that you would replicate the work that they're doing?
It's difficult. You see states like Texas and Indiana quickly building utility scale solar, but when you're looking at a market like Maryland, we're more land constrained, and we can't replicate what they're doing. And Maryland will never be 100% in-state generation either. So I think we're about 60% in-state generation. So when we're thinking of renewable energy in-state, we also have to think about what we're bringing into the state through PJM, and how do we support the work we're doing holistically. It's not just one state as an island. This energy transition is happening everywhere simultaneously. So if any one place is behind, it impacts all of us.
Well, Stephanie, I appreciate the opportunity to learn more from you. I'm sure others are certainly curious, not only the work that you're doing in Maryland, but how it might apply to the work that they're seeing being done in their own states, from Illinois to the Northeast and even further afield. The Midwest has a lot of challenges they're working through. Can you talk a bit about how MD-REA, the Maryland Renewable Energy Alliance, is taking action? And if folks wanted to follow along, how would they do so?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost at MD-REA, we're bringing together folks from across the energy and climate space to approach these challenges more holistically, like I've said. And our goal is to collaborate on these pieces to make them fit together. So, like we've said, Maryland has some of the most aggressive renewable energy goals in the country. We don't have the funding mechanisms to make these work currently. So, my goal is to get as many folks engaged as possible. Like, if they're not in energy currently, but they're interested in how this impacts them on the local level, I want everyone who's interested to feel like they're welcome in this conversation, and they're welcome to contribute, because there's so many opportunities to contribute beyond folks just having a job. We see in the climate space, there's so much more action on, community engagement, and for renewable energy, it's so wonky and it feels like so siloed from the rest of society. And I think as it becomes more and more a part of folks' lives, they're going to have more to say about it, and they're going to want to feel like they have a part of this conversation and that they're engaged with it as well. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot of pushbacks from folks who are being told, you need to have a heat pump. And they're going to say, what's a heat pump and why are you in my house? Like, we need to do more outreach to the folks that this is impacting. And I think that's front and center in the work we're going to do at MD-REA, in making sure that particularly low income folks and communities of color feel like they're a part of the conversation, and that their voices are being heard and how it impacts them, whether it's siting and permitting, or it's upgrades, or it's the increased price of electricity when we're moving toward electrification. Because I don't see a future where we are aggressively electrifying the grid and it doesn't result in a price increase. So how do we mitigate those realities from hitting some of the most vulnerable populations in our country? And I want to make sure that those populations have a space to be heard.
Well, Stephanie, I am personally very interested in seeing how Maryland addresses the challenges that we've outlined today, and I'm sure others will. I presume that you are active on LinkedIn. In fact, that's how you reached out to me, but is there a website that folks could check in to see the progress you're making with MD-REA?
So the best place to check would be www.mdrea.org.
Fantastic. Stephanie Johnson is the founder and president of MD-REA.org, Maryland Renewable Energy Alliance. Also a SunCast listener, at least part-time, and an advocate for not just renewable energy throughout the Mid-Atlantic, but for diversity in our industry. If you'd like to reach out to her, I would encourage you to do so. Stephanie, thank you for reaching out to me and for joining us here on SunCast.
Yes, thank you so much, Nico.
I want to thank you for taking the time to join us all the way through to the end of this episode. Thanks once again to Stephanie for investing her time into our own education. You see, markets like Maryland, in many ways, are bellwethers for whether or not we're going to meet these high RPS goals. Net zero by 2030, 100% renewables in more than a dozen states. How are we going to get there if we're plagued in markets like Maryland with land constraints, unreasonable expectations by landowners for what the rates should be, not enough land to develop the size of projects that we need, not enough buy-in from constituents on the technology requirements to get to the goals. You see, setting goals and policies is one thing, implementing, executing on them is another. Stephanie is on the front lines, as many of you are, trying to help ensure that we can get there. By the way, if you are on YouTube, take a moment and just click the like button and subscribe to the show. Help us show others content that will help you advance the clean energy transition, but also your career within it. And if you are on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other platform, please rate the podcast so that others can find content that you have found to help make them smarter as well and equip them on the front lines of this energy transition. I'd like to finally thank our sponsors who help make sure the show is free to you each and every week. They support the show, so all you got to do is pay your time and attention. You can find out more about them and their offers at mysuncast.com/sponsor. Remember, you are what you listen to. Thanks again for showing up, Solar Warrior. It's half the battle.